On today's Ask Zach, have you ever picked up a guitar and it just felt bad? It felt not right at all. Well, one of the major factors among a couple is nut width. And so that affects the string spacing. So in today's episode, we're going to do a deep dive on nut width. And we're going to talk about the vintage nut width, like on this 57 Esquire of 1 5/8, and why hardly any manufacturers are using this nut width anymore. Well, hello friends, and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about nut width. We're going to look at kind of the historical most common nut widths that you will see out in the wild, how it affects playability, and then we're going to talk about the vintage Fender nut width that was used all through the 50s, 60s, 70s of 1 5/8, and why few makers, especially boutique manufacturers or builders, are using that nut width anymore. All right, but first, pause for the cause. I need to thank all of my Patreon members and everyone that's picked up a t-shirt or a coffee mug or put money in the tip jar or just given me a thumbs up, subscribed, commented. I appreciate it all. Thank you. All right, let's dive in. So, of course, the nut width is, the distance from here to here. And it has varied a lot through the years. There's a lot of different nut widths. And really, they aren't a huge difference between one and another, unless you're talking about one extreme to the next. However, our hands are able to feel very small differences. Just like you probably couldn't look at a string that's a 12 and a string that's a 9. You probably couldn't look at them and tell which one was which. But I bet if you touched it, you could tell the difference. Just not even trying to bend it or anything like that. And then of course, if you put it on a guitar, you can absolutely feel the difference between even like a 9 and a 10 high E string. So our hands can feel very small differences in size. So now let's dive in on what are the most common nut widths that you will see. So the narrowest you'll probably see is something like on a student guitar, and that's 1 1/2. That's a really narrow nut. The only full size, that's going to be like a short scale guitar, smaller body, like 3/4 size or something like that. The only time you see that on like vintage instruments or things like that are like on the, some of the vintage Duosonic and Music Lane, some of the vintage Fender student models. Or Fender actually offered a narrow nut width that was called the A option. If you remember, of course, the neck stamps that you would see on the heel of the neck, you'd have the 3 that stood for Telecaster and Esquire. Then you'd have the Jan for January, Jan. Then you'd have the year, let's say 65, and then you'd have a letter. And B was the standard 1 5/8. A was the narrow width of 1 1/2 inch. And that was rarely, actually all of the other, whether it's wider or narrower, those other options, A, C, or D, were rarely taken. And those necks are super rare. I've only seen one A neck, and that was Kenny Vaughan has or at least had a shell pink 1966 Stratocaster that he used to play. And there's footage of him playing on Austin City Limits with Sweethearts of the Rodeo and with, I think, Hal Ketchum playing that 66 Strat with an A neck in shell pink. But yeah, so 1 1/2, that's, the super narrow kind of student guitar. The next size up from that would be the 1 9/16, and that was the size that Gibson went to in mid to late 1965. So they had been doing 1 11/16, and then they narrowed it down. And a lot of people don't like these necks, And those guitars are a lot less expensive when you go from a wide nut 65 to a narrow nut 65, like a 335 or something like that. There's usually a fairly, there's a jump in value because the people usually want the wider nut. It's a pretty narrow nut and string spacing. Of course, that correlates. And a lot of people just really don't like them. Larry Carlton famously played a 69 335 throughout most of his career. And I've played that guitar, and yes, the nut is very narrow. However, it has a lot of beef on the back of the neck. And so it kind of helps compensate for that, but still it's pretty narrow. All right, then after the 1 9/16, the next jump up is vintage Fender width of 1 5/8, or what you would see as the B on those neck heels. And that's what you see all through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then Fender started kind of messing with that and getting a little wider in the 80s, especially with the American standards and such. Then you get to 1.65, which is just this like incremental step up. It's a millimeter, wider than 1 5/8. And that is actually what most vintage replica builders or even Fender do at this point on vintage style guitars. They do not do 1 5/8 most of the time. And in fact, a lot of builders won't do 1 5/8. And it has to do with string spacing and modern playing styles and things like that. And I'm going to get into that more. So you have, so the 1 5/8 would be 1.625. And then then you have 1.65. So it's just ever so slightly wider. Still feels, very comfortable even to a guy, like me. So here's my Danocaster, which is actually my, this was built as kind of a backup to this guitar. This is my 57 Esquire, and this is my, my Danocaster that has the same shaped neck and everything. And so I use this a lot, especially when I don't want to fly with this guy or something like that. But it has the 1.65, which I'm fine with. It's just a touch wider. All right, next up is 1 11/16. So this is the nut width that you think of when you're looking at like, a lot of, Gibson guitars, a lot of Paul Reed Smith guitars, a lot of Martin acoustics, especially modern acoustics. They tend to be 1 11/16. That's a very popular nut width. And sometimes it's even used on Fendery type guitars, especially if it's a little bit more of a modern instrument with a flatter radius, big frets. You'll see these 1 11/16 nut widths on even, Fendery type guitars. For those that like the 1 5/8, it kind of throws them off. But for those that are Gibson or PRS guys, they love that nut width. Next step up is, because now we're starting into less common nut widths, and that's 1 3/4, 1 3/4. That is mainly seen in pre-war acoustic guitars, pre-war Martins and Gibsons, and the reissues of such. So I guess, you will see a lot of them with like Collings and Santa Cruz and vintage reissue Martins and such. They will have 1 3/4 width at the nut. Really don't see that in electric guitars very often. However, that is one of the options that Fender did back in the 50s and 60s, was the C neck. So again, super rare. I've never seen one in person. However, it's been famously said that Ry Cooder's Coodercaster, which I don't believe he calls it his Coodercaster, he probably just calls it his Strat, but the Sunburst one with the lap steel pickups and that bit and all the tortoise and everything on it, it's beautiful. That has a C neck on it where it is 1 3/4 at the nut. All right. Next up is an even rarer, and that's 1 7/8. So we're almost to 2 inches at the nut. We're almost to like classical guitar width. This is mainly seen on pre-war guitars that did not have adjustable truss rods, that maybe had an ebony rod or a steel rod that wasn't adjustable. It's a big neck, and it's a very wide fretboard, and that was the D option from Fender. So, and I've only read about these, and so apparently Stevie Ray Vaughan had a D neck on his #1 guitar at some point. Again, you know, I've never held one, but I'm sure there's you know, a collector dude that has one, and hopefully will chime in and send us a photo. So those are the nut widths that you will commonly see out in the wild. And so how does this affect the feel and the playability? Well, it's kind of obvious. It affects the string spacing. So of course, the wider the nut, the further apart the strings can be. And so that of course is going to have a big effect on where your fingers go. Because all of a sudden, if you've been using a narrower nut and all of a sudden you have a wider nut, well, all of a sudden the strings are further apart, and that kind of muscle memory, whether it's going from chord to chord, or if it's lead playing and you're going from string to string, it's going to affect that, especially in this area. Because of course the neck gets wider as it goes up, but it's going to have a big effect, especially in kind of this area of the neck. So it throws me off. I kind of have to think differently, like when I pick up an acoustic guitar, you know, versus a 1 5/8, you know, that's like 1 11/16 or 1 3/4, or when I'm picking up a Tele, an old one like this one that's 1 5/8. So yes, really big effect, because you have muscle memory and you get used to playing things a certain way. You get used to fingering things a certain way. You get used to even things like, you know, on this guitar, you know, I will many times do an A add 2, you know, that you know, some people would do with 2 fingers. Well, I do it with 1. And there's other things that are like that, where I'm used to, because of the string spacing, I can use 1 finger to hit certain things, or double stops, and I can even use, you know, more of the tip of the finger. I'm not talking about using the flat, you know, part of your finger. So it can really throw off, you know, how you play. And also, you know, if you wrap your thumb over the top of the neck, which I do, you know, I will play an F chord like this, you know, first position F chord, instead of like this. If you can see my arm posture and my posture and the way my arm is moving and such, you can see this, like this is kind of a normal playing position, but then like having to go down like this, it's weird. I mean, it's not comfortable. Now, of course, there's probably not that many times I played this big old F, you know, shape. I'm probably playing, you know, another inversion or something like that. But that's just an example of how the string spacing really affects, you know, how you interface with the guitar, and how, you know, and how you would play, how many fingers you'd use to make a chord, and also how far you kind of your fingers have to be apart from each other, up and down, versus, you know, spread this way. So it does make a big difference, and it can throw you off. Now, in saying all this, you know, I'm not saying that you need to have all your guitars that have the exact same nut width and the same string gauge and the same frets and all this jazz. I'm not saying that. You know, it's good to have different guitars that pull out different things, you know, from you. But it's also okay to have a preference, to where it's like, I like this nut width. And one of the things I'm not hitting on today, which really all kind of hits together with this, is, you know, we're going to do a later episode on radius and also neck shape and frets. So, I mean, that's a whole other thing that also influences that. And then, of course, you could say scale length, and, you know, whether it's bolt-on, whether there's angle at the body. So there's a lot of factors in this, but we're just covering one subject today. All right. now let's talk about vintage Fender nut width of 1 5/8 and why current like boutique builders don't use that. Even Fender rarely uses it. So the deal is string spacing and modern playing styles and such. Now you have an issue with a lot of players have it where the high E string and the low E string are almost falling off the fretboard, especially depending on their playing style and the way they bend and the gauge of string that they use. And so it's such an issue, you know, because it really has to be set up right with the, you know, on a vintage guitar. You know, and a lot of it also has to do with the string gauges that were used in the past that didn't really move around very much. I mean, they were, you know, 12 through 53, and obviously that would kind of squeeze things in a bit, but still they were very taut and they weren't really going anywhere. And then when you put like a set of 9s or 10s or 9.5s like I use, it becomes, you know, really important, like how far, you know, the frets have to come out just as far as they can to the end. They have to be careful, you know, dressing, you know, the ends and all of that. So a lot of builders just went away from 1 5/8. And a lot of them, even if you ask them, hey, I want 1 5/8, a lot of them will not do it because it's just problematic. It is easier to do 1.65, which is just a millimeter difference. It's wider, and it's really not, you know, again, you can get used to it, but it just makes it to where the high E string and the low E string have more area, you know, so that they don't fall off the edge and you're not squeezing it against there. And like when you're playing a G chord, you know, first position G chord, you know, if you mash too hard, you're not shoving it off the end of the neck and it sounding like poop. So I love 1 5/8, and but I'm okay with the touch wider. It doesn't bother me. Now, if you go up to 1 11/16 on a Fender type guitar, it does kind of throw me off because it's kind of like an anti-muscle memory for me in the way I play. I will say, just, you know, to throw things down the rabbit hole for a second, I do like a soft V neck as far as the back of the neck, usually, you know, between 0.88 and 0.9. I like the vintage radius. I like the 7.25, but I hate vintage frets. And so I always put bigger frets like 6105s or maybe something that's a little shorter than that. And that's what I like on a guitar. All right. Well, we've covered that. Now I'm going to have a little surprise at the end. I'm going to have a little clip of me playing last weekend in Tulsa, Oklahoma at Track 5, which is a venue at the Hard Rock Casino there in Tulsa. And my buddy Rod took some iPhone footage of me and Paul Bogart's band playing a little instrumental. And so I'm always coming up with these little instrumentals that I either use on the show or I use live. You know, sometimes, especially when you're playing like 4 sets at a casino, it's nice to kind of come back on with an instrumental. And that's what bands used to do back in the day. They'd use Hideaway or, you know, all sorts of other things to, you know, to kind of bring, you know, to kind of let the audience know that, hey, the show's starting again. And then you'd go into, you know, a vocal tune. So one of these tunes that I came up with, we started calling it Two Lips, like TU-LIPS, just as kind of a play on words. And it's kind of like a Brent Mason-y kind of 90s kind of thing. It's a low string thing. And again, I'm using this Esquire in the video, and I'm just going to play the just the head of it really quick so you can kind of hear it. And then you'll of course see it live with this guitar through my old deluxe reverb with I think I've got a compressor and a Strymon delay on, and that's it. So this is the melody. guys. Well, hope you enjoy the clip, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Jacob's got a tag That's what we call tulips right there.